It is now my distinct honor to introduce Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher, who's the president of the California Labor Federation, to address us. Lorena was formerly the chief officer of the San Diego and Imperial County's Labor Council, and then she was elected to California State Assembly in 2013. She was the first Latina to serve as the chairwoman of the Legislative Appropriations Committee and was the longest serving chair in history. Lorena now serves as the first woman and the first person of color to serve as chief officer of the California Labor Federation, AFL-CIO. Again, Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher. Thank you so much, Ms. Fletcher, for joining us today.
I want to thank you for inviting me. It was so great to hear Secretary Sue's words, because she does know California labor very well, and she knows what we've been through and what we've been doing. I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about kind of how we got here. You know, I think about all the work that we do and all the fights that we wage, and it really makes me wonder, it makes me think historically about who we are and where we are as workers, as a society. So I probably don't have to remind this crew, but I always start when I'm talking about kind of the future of workers, talking about the past. And we know that in the 1930s, when Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, there was like a dirty little secret. It wasn't a secret, really. We don't talk about it a lot. And that's that there are certain workers who were completely left out of those protections. Those workers, by and large, were farm workers and domestic workers. Now, why is this important? Those are workers that it was vestiges of slavery, quite frankly. They were workers at the time, work that was done primarily by Black Americans, and it was work that had previously been done by slaves. And even when there was discussions about kind of reforming labor law in this country, there was open racism by a number of senators and congressional members from the South who said, we can't be insistent that these former slaves, that these Black Americans are gonna be paid the same as everybody else, as well as a white person doing manual labor. And so we made a decision to not include certain workers in labor protections. And, you know, that's important here in California, because we have spent, especially in the last 40, 50 years, at trying to use state law to circumvent that, to actually add rights in for workers who didn't get protected in federal law. So what have we done? Well, we have the, ALRB to allow farm workers to unionize. We, in 2015, passed farm worker overtime finally, after years and years and decades of trying, finally getting farm workers to the same standard as everybody else, the 8-hour day, as we're so proud of in California. We've, just recently passed a card check bill for farm workers so that they can utilize the same process that our public employees, that firefighters and teachers use, in order to form a union without intimidation. We passed the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, although domestic workers in California still are not protected like every other worker. So we still have a lot of work to do. Why did we do this? Well, I worked really hard on the farm worker aspect, and people would ask me why I use so much political oxygen to get what we needed in that. And I would say, look, as people rise to power and they see these workers not just as workers, but as their own family members. My father came to this country as a farm worker. He worked in the fields and then in the packing house. I know when you look at a worker and treat them differently, and treat them as a lesser, that's saying something about the way you treat them as a human being, right? And so to me, it was, of course, people who are farm workers or domestic workers deserve the same rights as everybody else. Now, at the same time in California, as we were doing that and things we're celebrating and continue to do that, we saw kind of the biggest threat to traditional, basically standards that were built, almost a century ago. And that is through the gig work that we now see kind of exploding all over the United States. So, as we're basically putting more rights into the bucket, we see these big corporations just totally ignoring all of the rights in the bucket through the gig economy. And so when this California Supreme Court decided in April of 2015 that, or 2019, that the Dynamex decision, that the ABC test should be used in California to determine employee status, that was a great opportunity and one that the labor movement took in order to ensure that those rights were codified. The reason that Uber and Lyft and Postmates and all these gig companies have utilized misclassification as an economic tool is to save themselves money. But the truth is, gig workers have never really been, at least these type of gig workers have never really been their own little business, as you would expect under an independent contractor kind of theory. Instead, they were simply denied the rights to minimum wage and overtime, the right to workers' compensation, paid sick days in California, paid family leave, the right to health and safety on the job, the right to unemployment insurance. That was all taken away from them through the misclassification, the systematic misclassification by these companies. So when Dynamex was decided, we took that opportunity to say, okay, let's solidify the ABC rule in labor law across the board in California. Now, we had to, of course, look at some things that were traditionally truly independent contractors. So we used the Dynamex decision to determine what those things were. Basically, workers who had the skill level, the education, the ability to truly negotiate contracts for themselves, highly skilled workers who, are in high demand, things like doctors and lawyers. We're less worried about them being misclassified, although they can still be misclassified. But we fought to ensure that gig work was in fact classified as employees, because in every definition of the word, they're being controlled by these platforms. Their prices are fixed. They're not allowed to go out and get other business. This isn't a small business situation. This is an employee situation. Of course, as those people on this call probably know, although we were able to pass that bill, AB 5, the California Labor Federation, I actually was the assemblywoman at the time and passed that bill. Uber and Lyft and Postmates ran a $226 million initiative to upend those rules. So Proposition 22. Right now, in fact, this month, the California Supreme Court will hear the arguments on whether or not Proposition 22 was in fact constitutional and whether it should in full or part stay or be reversed. And we anticipate after that ruling of working harder to get any types of rights that these workers could have. Now, why is this so important? A lot of people ask me, do you regret not trying to cut a deal with Uber and Lyft? Do you regret not trying to somehow allow them out of the ABC test? And the truth is, I don't. I think what we legislated was correct. And I think as a labor movement and as a movement for workers, we have to stand by the fact that all workers deserve dignity and respect and those basic labor standards. So when I started talking about people of color, in particular Black folks in California, which later became immigrants, Asian immigrants, and then Latino immigrants, the work that was being done by people of color basically has been discounted. It is vestiges of slavery. And what you see in the gig economy so often is those same workers who are new immigrants, people of color, people who are from marginalized communities. And we thought that if you start to accept that a company can and should treat them differently, that it says something about the way you respect those workers. We always believe you have to fight for more and fight to get to those standards that we so much want. It was incredible for me. I started my career obviously in organized labor and then went into the legislature and came back. And I remember when I left for the legislature, we were still fighting Walmart. You know, as we continue to do, we would use Walmart as an example of the absolute worst employer. What they would do to workers and how they would abuse basically their right to organize. They shut down a store once when it organized. I mean, this is what we were facing and fighting alongside our brothers and sisters at UFCW. And I say funny, but the ironic thing is I get into the legislature and we're dealing with these gig companies, and our request of the gig companies was simply to treat their workers as well as Walmart did. Think about that. All we asked is that they paid minimum wage and overtime and did the very basics that we expect, in the fact that, quite frankly, some of our worst employers have to do. Obviously, that's a fight that will continue. But what are some of the things that we're going to continue to do? Well, we're going to continue to insist that we're not signing away people's rights simply because they're being hired through a platform. I think this is one of the most dangerous things about the gig economy that we're now fighting. And when we look at things like healthcare and higher ed, something that keeps coming back in. Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, all the delivery companies, they all say that they're not the employer, that they're simply a platform that are bringing together a customer and a small business, basically. Well, we know that's not true. There's just far too much control that is exercised by these companies. But the dangerous thing about that argument is it can be extended and has been in every other field. So you have companies that are popping up that are saying, we're the Uber of healthcare, we're the Uber of education, we're the Uber of tutors, we're the Uber of warehousing, right? And we see things like Instawork, and we see things like Quick that are actually out there trying to misclassify additional workers on the notion that, well, we're just temporarily putting them somewhere, and we're hooking up these individuals with this company, and it's not us who are the employers. Well, that's simply not true. We feel that the intellectual honesty with which we attacked and continue to fight the gig companies allows us to continue to fight these new platform companies. And in fact, one of the things that happened during AB5 is it became very clear from the gig companies that they just weren't going to abide by the law. I mean, not just they didn't just act that way. They actually came into my office and said, you can do whatever you want. We'll just continue to hold it up in court. We'll settle cases, we'll use arbitration, and we're just going to continue with our business model no matter what you do to us. And so we went at that moment and looked at enforcement. And I think that was great that Secretary Sue talked about enforcement, because it is what's most important. You can write all the laws in the world, but if they're not enforced, it doesn't matter. And we see that a lot in California. We are at the forefront of the best labor laws in the country, but we lag far behind when it comes to enforcement, and that is a problem. And so what we did with AB5 is we put in injunctive relief. And so at that time, we looked at the consumer code basically and said, okay, the same way large city attorneys and DAs could sue under that, we wanted them to be able to sue to stop the misclassification labor practices, to go into court and get an injunction and to actually stop it from happening. For us, that's the most important thing that can be done. The second is making workers whole and to, ensure that everybody has their day in court. But first, we want to stop the practice from happening. So we put that into AB5. And because we didn't cut a deal with platform companies, and we never acquiesced to this idea that a platform company is somehow any different, it is in fact often just a temp agency online, and it's no different than gig work has been for years and years. Because we took that step, we were able to preserve our arguments on other platform companies. So just recently, despite, Prop 22 only dealt with drivers and delivery drivers, but everything else is still subject to the ABC test. And so recently, we were very excited to work with the San Francisco City Attorney, David Chu, who was a fellow assembly member when we wrote the bill and understands it well. And he actually had the first settlement with a company that was misclassifying their workers. He got them reclassified. He got $1 million for the workers and fines so that he can continue his good work as well, doing labor law enforcement. What it taught us is, although we can't always fight off these corporate influences that want to go to the ballot. We have a real problem with that in California. To undo all the great work we've done in the legislature, we can stop the bleeding, and we can decide that we're going to continue to fight for those workers until every worker is treated the same under the law. The end of the day, that's what we're looking for. Every worker should have these rights that we have fought so hard for decades, and we should not accept, in the name of flexibility, that somehow we have to give up all these other rights. And so we're continuing to work on enforcement of misclassification in particular, but all types of labor law, and looking to expand the use of, and we have in fact written laws to expand the use of public injunctions. That means that people who are public attorneys, they're public prosecutors, city attorneys, and DAs, not just in those big cities, but statewide, can actually bring injunctive relief in labor law cases. We continue to try to expand that. We are now trying to get injunctive relief under PAGA as well, because we know so often lawsuits are not always about fixing the problem. And so we want to make sure, as lawsuits are utilized, it's a great tool to get workers their rights that they need and deserve, that the actual bad practices stop as well. The Labor Federation is also working on the future of work when it looks at technology and artificial intelligence in ways that individuals' work is changing. It started, to be honest, with the app, right? It's a technological change. And then we saw quotas in warehouses, and we did the first bill that it's now being introduced at the national level to talk about algorithmic management and how you ensure that the worker has some agency and some control over what they're expected to do and their rights at work despite the algorithm. But as we are chasing down every form of new technology, something else pops up. And of course, the thing we're talking about most these days is artificial intelligence, although we're also putting a bunch of things into that bucket. So we try to say technology in general. And our position has been, and the things we are pushing, is that workers have to have a say in technology changes at work. The workers, the frontline workers, usually know best, in fact, not usually, always know best, how technology affects the delivery of their service or what they're doing, and they should be part of that conversation. Of course, that conversation only happens if there is a union in the workplace, and that these changes are a mandatory subject of bargaining. So that is one thing we're seeking, but we're also seeking the basic principle that workers' voices are respected in procurement and utilization of AI, that their privacy is also protected, and a notion that we can and should regulate technology. I think the same way we kind of saw Uber and Lyft and these platform companies come in, and they got to a point where everybody said they're too big to fail. Oh, it happens. The things are changing. You have to accept these changes. Our position is, I mean, this sounds weird, but I'm against progress, right? I'm against that type of change when we say it's inevitable that you have to accept that rights are being taken away for the bottom line of some company or convenience of some company. And instead, what we need to say is, how do we protect workers? We can and should regulate technology to ensure that there's minimal job loss, to ensure that workers are respected and heard on the job, and to make sure that communities continue to flourish. We in our work refuse to just go to the easy, expand the social safety net. We don't think that that's the answer. We think, in fact, that there's dignity in work, all of work, and that we need to ensure that that dignity exists and continues to exist. I always ask people to look at groups of people's arguments. And we talk a lot about intellectual honesty because we don't want to be one of those groups. You can hear people talk about how we're not, all these technology changes, and because we demand too much for minimum wage and all of these other things, that we're going to lose jobs, right? And that we just need to accept this. We're going to lose jobs. Maybe we need UBI. Maybe we got to figure out how to upskill workers, all these things that we're told. At the same time, some of the same people are saying our retirement age is too low. So they apparently want older Americans to continue to work longer at the same time as they're telling us there aren't enough jobs. None of it actually makes sense together. And instead, what we are going to do is continue to preserve and actually demand more of being able to retire with dignity at a reasonable age, at the age now of retirement. At the same time, we often hear about, of course, the lack of jobs, but then we're seeing workers being forced into overtime. We support minimizing the number of hours that are required to work as long as workers are paid for a 40-hour work week. We don't want to get rid of the 8-hour day, our notion of overtime after 8 hours, but we do support, efforts to shorten the work week and pay workers the same. If jobs are truly going to replace individual, there are strategies within our value system that we can pursue and will pursue as policies. So this is some of the stuff we're working on. We understand that work is changing. It has always been changing through the history of the world. Unions are more necessary now than ever. People understand the need for unions. People are excited about joining unions. We have more organizing leads that we can even keep up with because workers want a voice on the job. And this next generation knows better than anyone that what the politicians have not been able to do is fix this economy. So they're taking it into their own hands and saying through collective bargaining, through strikes, from withholding my labor, from demanding more, I'm going to fix this income inequality. And we need to give those young people and the older ones who are making this decision the tools to do that. So in my talk there, I know that you're going to go to a little bit more and then a Q&A, so I'll stand by for the Q&A.
Thank you for a really inspiring talk about the agenda for the labor movement. And we certainly, at the California Labor Lab, want to know how we can help you in implementing this humane and important agenda.